Chapter 1. The Village Whisper. The late afternoon sun cast golden threads across the hedgerows of Glaswick, a village so like St. Mary Mead that Miss Jane Marple felt an instant kinship with its tidy cottages and bustling tea-room. She had come at the invitation of her old friend Mrs. Celia Bantry, who had recently taken up residence in Glaswick to escape the dreadful clamour of London. But it was not Celia's charming letter about rose gardens that had truly drawn Miss Marple. It was the postscript, scribbled in haste. "Something odd is afoot, Jane. A note about a shattered lens was left at the vicarage. No one knows what it means." Miss Marple sat now in Celia's cosy parlour, her knitting needles clicking softly as she listened to her friend's account. "It's the talk of the village," Celia said, pouring tea with a touch of excitement. "The note was found yesterday, tucked under the vicar's door. Just 3 words. The lens is shattered. No signature, no explanation. And now everyone's whispering about Edwin Glass, the photographer. They say he's been acting strange lately." "Strange?" Miss Marple's eyes, bright and bird-like, lifted from her knitting. "In what way, Celia?" "Oh, you know how villages are," Celia replied, waving a hand. "Edwin's always been a bit of a loner, snapping his photographs and developing them in that dark room of his. But lately he's been downright secretive. Mrs. Phipps at the post office swears she saw him burning papers in his garden at midnight." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind already sifting through parallels. In St. Mary Mead she had known a grocer who burned receipts to hide a gambling debt. Secrets, she knew, often hid in plain sight. "And this note," she said, "was it written by hand?" "Yes, in a hurried scrawl," Celia said. "The vicar, Mr. Harrow, showed it to me this morning. He's quite rattled, poor man. Thinks it's some sort of warning." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers pausing on a stitch. "A lens," she mused. "Such an odd choice of words. It suggests focus, clarity, or perhaps something revealed that someone wished to keep hidden." Celia leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Do you think it's connected to Edwin? Everyone knows he's been photographing the village for years. Portraits, weddings, even the church fete. If anyone's seen something they shouldn't, it's him." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone mild, but her thoughts sharp. "I should like to meet this Mr. Glass. A photographer sees more than most, whether he means to or not." The opportunity came sooner than expected. As the 2 women stepped out for an evening stroll, a commotion erupted near the village green. A small crowd had gathered outside a narrow cottage with a sign reading "Glass Photography." Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the open door, the flicker of a lantern inside, and the anxious murmurs of onlookers. "What's happened?" Celia called to Mrs. Phipps, who was clutching her shawl tightly. "It's Edwin," Mrs. Phipps whispered, her eyes wide. "They've just found him, dead, and his camera smashed to bits, lens and all." Miss Marple's heart gave a quiet thud, not of shock, but of recognition. The shattered lens. She glanced at Celia, who looked pale, then back at the cottage. "I think," she said softly, "we had best see for ourselves." As they approached the doorway, Miss Marple's mind was already at work, piecing together the village's whispers. A lens, she thought, could capture guilt as easily as beauty. And in Glaswick, it seemed, someone had feared what it might show. Chapter 2. The Photographer's Secret. The interior of Edwin Glass's cottage was as dim as a storm cloud, lit only by a single lantern casting jagged shadows across the walls. Miss Marple stepped carefully over the threshold, her sensible shoes silent on the worn floorboards. Celia Bantry hovered behind, clutching her handbag as if it might ward off the chill of death. The air smelled of chemicals and dust. A photographer's domain left in disarray. Constable Reed, a young man with a nervous twitch, stood guard near the body. Edwin Glass lay sprawled beside a splintered oak table, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. His shirt was crumpled, one hand clutching a shard of glass that glinted cruelly in the lantern's glow. Nearby, a camera lay in pieces, its lens shattered into a dozen jagged fragments. "Miss Marple," Constable Reed said, touching his cap awkwardly. "Didn't expect you here. It's a bad business." "Indeed it is," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle but her gaze sharp as she took in the scene. "May I look closer, Constable? I shan't disturb anything." Reed hesitated, then nodded. "Just mind the glass, ma'am." Miss Marple knelt, her knees protesting only slightly, and studied Edwin's face. He was perhaps 50, with a lean jaw and hair streaked with grey. His expression held no fear, only a faint surprise, as if death had caught him mid-thought. The shard in his hand was curved, unmistakably part of a lens. "Curious," she murmured. "He held on to this even as he fell. Looks like someone bashed him with the camera," Reed offered, pointing to a gash on Edwin's temple. "Then smashed it to bits. Must have been angry, whoever did it." "Angry," Miss Marple echoed, "or afraid?" She rose, her eyes drifting to the room's corners. A curtained alcove led to what she guessed was the darkroom, its door ajar. Shelves held albums, rolls of film, and a ledger marked "Clients." A single photograph hung on the wall, a portrait of a young woman with haunted eyes, her smile brittle as frost. Celia, who had been peering over Miss Marple's shoulder, whispered, "That's Clara Harrow, the vicar's sister. She left Glasswick years ago. Why would Edwin keep her picture up?" "A question worth asking," Miss Marple said, filing the detail away. She turned to Reed. "Constable, who found Mr. Glass?" "Mrs. Lydia Trent," he said, nodding toward a woman standing just outside. "She runs the bakery. Came to collect a portrait and found this." Miss Marple glanced at Lydia Trent, a stout woman in her 40s with flour-dusted hands and a face pale as dough. Beside her stood Dr. Martin Haydock, Glasswick's physician, who was murmuring to a tall man in a tweed coat, Mr. Victor Crane, the local solicitor, if Miss Marple recalled Celia's gossip correctly. Their voices were low, but their glances darted toward the cottage like moths to a flame. "Mrs. Trent," Miss Marple called softly, stepping outside. "Might I have a word?" Lydia's eyes widened, but she nodded. "It was awful," she blurted. "I only came for my son's picture. The door was open and there he was, dead. I screamed and Dr. Haydock came running." "Did you notice anything unusual?" Miss Marple asked, her tone as warm as a fireside chat. "Before you entered, perhaps?" Lydia frowned, twisting her apron. "Well, there was a shadow moving, in the lane, just as I turned the corner. Thought it was a cat at first, but it was too big. Whoever it was, they were gone quick." Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Trent. You've been most helpful." As Lydia hurried off, Celia tugged Miss Marple's sleeve. "Jane, what do you make of it? A shadow, a smashed camera. It's all so sinister." "Sinister, yes," Miss Marple said, her eyes lingering on the broken lens fragments glinting in the doorway, but also revealing. A lens shows what we wish to see and what we fear others might. I suspect Mr. Glass saw something someone wished to shatter forever. She glanced at the crowd, noting Victor Crane's stiff posture and Dr. Haydock's quick departure. Then her gaze returned to the cottage, where the darkroom's open door seemed to beckon. "Celia," she said, "I think a closer look at Mr. Glass's work might tell us more than he ever could." Chapter 3. Shadows in the Darkroom. The darkroom's door creaked as Miss Marple nudged it open, revealing a cramped space thick with the tang of developing chemicals. A single red bulb swung faintly overhead, casting a blood-like glow across trays of liquid and scattered negatives. Celia Bantry lingered at the threshold, her nose wrinkling. "Jane, it's positively eerie in here," she whispered, "like stepping into a ghost's parlour." "Ghosts leave no clues, Celia," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm, but her eyes darting over every detail. Men, however, are less careful. She adjusted her spectacles and stepped inside, her fingers brushing the edge of a workbench cluttered with bottles and torn scraps of photographic paper. The darkroom was Edwin Glass's sanctum, and it bore the marks of a man interrupted. A tray of developer held a half-submerged print, now ruined, its image blurred into smears of grey. A clothesline sagged with pinned negatives, their tiny frames glinting like secrets caught in amber. Miss Marple leaned closer, squinting at one strip. "Landscapes," she murmured, "and faces, but whose?" Celia, braving a step inside, pointed to a locked cabinet in the corner. "That looks suspicious, don't you think? Why lock up photographs unless they're worth hiding?" "Quite right," Miss Marple said, her tone approving. She tested the cabinet's handle, but it held firm. "Constable Reed may need to open this, though I suspect Mr. Glass's killer already took what they feared most." Her gaze fell to the floor, where a faint smear of mud curved toward the workbench. It was fresh, unlike the dust that coated the rest of the room. "Someone was here," she said softly, "and not long before Mrs. Trent arrived." "Jane, look!" Celia gasped, pointing to a notebook wedged beneath a tray. Its cover was stained, but the word "private" was scrawled across it in Edwin's precise hand. Miss Marple eased it free, careful not to smudge the pages. She opened it to find a log of photographs, each entry noting a date, subject, and cryptic shorthand. One caught her eye. CH, 1945, Orchard, Burn. Another read, VC, Last WK, Manorgate, Watch. The final entry, dated 2 days ago, was simply, "Lens knows, must act." CH could be Clara Harrow, Celia said, peering over Miss Marple's shoulder. And VC, Victor Crane, perhaps. But what's this about a lens knowing? Miss Marple closed the notebook, her mind threading connections. A lens captures moments, Celia. Moments some might kill to erase. These initials suggest Edwin was more than a village photographer. He was a keeper of secrets. A sharp rap at the cottage's front door startled them both. Constable Reed's voice called out, "Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock's here with news about the body." They stepped back into the main room, where Dr. Haydock stood, his face grim under his greying moustache. "It's murder, no question," he said brusquely. "Blunt force to the head, likely from the camera itself. But here's the odd bit. Edwin's knuckles were bruised, as if he fought back. And there's a trace of red wax on his sleeve." "Wax?" Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. "Like sealing wax?" "Exactly," Haydock said. "Not common around here. Thought you'd want to know." "Thank you, Doctor," Miss Marple said, her mind already racing. Red wax suggested letters, promises, perhaps blackmail. She glanced at Celia, who looked ready to burst with questions, and gave a slight shake of her head. "Not yet." As Haydock left, Miss Marple's eyes returned to the dark room's open door. "The mud, the notebook, the locked cabinet," they whispered, of a man who saw too much. But the red wax, she thought, was a thread to someone else entirely. "Celia," she said, "I believe tomorrow's tea at the vicarage will be most illuminating. People talk when they're nervous, and Glasswick, I suspect, is growing very nervous indeed." Chapter 4. The Vicar's Confession. The vicarage sat at the edge of Glasswick, its stone walls draped in ivy that seemed to whisper secrets to the morning breeze. Miss Marple arrived promptly at 10, her straw hat tilted just so, her knitting bag tucked under one arm. Celia Bantry, ever eager for village intrigue, walked beside her, chattering about the vicar's odd behaviour since the note about the shattered lens had appeared. "Mr. Harrow's been jumpy as a cat," Celia said, lowering her voice as they approached the door. "Yesterday he dropped a teacup when I mentioned Edwin's death. Smashed it clean to bits." "People often break things when they're hiding something," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild, but her eyes gleaming with interest, "or when they fear what's already broken." The door opened before Celia could knock, revealing Mr. Timothy Harrow, a wiry man in his late 40s, with a face lined by worry. His clerical collar was slightly askew, and his smile flickered like a candle in a draught. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry," he said, ushering them inside. "Such a kindness to visit in these troubling times." The parlour was modest, with faded chintz curtains and a tea-tray set for 3. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the vicar. His hands trembled as he poured the tea, and a faint flush crept up his neck when Celia mentioned Edwin Glass. "A terrible loss," Harrow said, his voice tight. "Edwin was a fixture here. His photographs captured Glasswick's heart." "And perhaps more," Miss Marple said gently, her eyes never leaving his face. "I understand a note was left at your door, Mr. Harrow, about a shattered lens. Have you any idea what it meant?" Harrow's cup rattled against its saucer. He set it down, clasping his hands as if to steady them. I've puzzled over it," he admitted. "It seemed a prank at first, but now, with Edwin's death—" He trailed off, his gaze darting to a photograph on the mantel. A younger Harrow with a woman who shared his sharp cheekbones. Clara, Miss Marple guessed, the sister from Edwin's portrait. "Mr. Harrow," Miss Marple said, her voice soft as a lullaby, "you seem burdened. If there's something you know about Edwin, it might ease your mind to share it. Villages, I find, keep no secrets from the dead." The vicar's shoulders sagged, and for a moment silence hung heavy. Then he spoke, his words tumbling out like stones from a wall. "Edwin came to me 2 nights ago," he said. "Late, after evensong. He was agitated, said he'd photographed something he shouldn't have. Something that could ruin lives." "Ruin lives?" Celia leaned forward, her eyes wide. "Whose lives?" "He wouldn't say," Harrow replied, rubbing his temples. "Only that he'd hidden the negative somewhere safe and meant to confront someone. He asked for my prayers. Miss Marple said he feared for his soul." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind weaving Harrow's words with the notebook's cryptic entries. "Did he mention a lens?" she asked. "Or red wax, perhaps?" Harrow blinked, startled. "No, nothing about wax. But he did say the lens was his mistake. It sees too much, he told me. I thought he meant his camera, but now he shook his head, lost. "Thank you, Mr. Harrow," Miss Marple said, her smile kind but her thoughts racing. "A photograph that could ruin lives, a lens that saw too much. It pointed to blackmail, or something darker." And Harrow's flush, his nervous glances at Clara's picture, suggested he knew more than he'd confessed. As they rose to leave, Miss Marple's eyes caught a detail on the mantel, a small brass key, half hidden behind a candlestick. It was too small for a door, too ornate for a drawer. A cabinet, perhaps. She filed it away, nodding politely as Harrow saw them out. "Jane," Celia whispered once they were in the lane, "do you think he's telling the truth?" "Part of it," Miss Marple said, her gaze distant. "But in my experience, Celia, confessions are like photographs, developed in halves. The full picture takes time, and I suspect Mr. Harrow's sister may hold the other half." The village clock chimed noon, and Miss Marple's steps quickened. Tea with the villagers awaited, and with it, she hoped, a clearer focus on Glasswick's tangled web of guilt. Chapter 5. Tea and Suspicions. The tea-room at Glasswick's Heart was a hive of clinking china and hushed voices. Its windows steamed from the warmth of gossip and scones. Miss Marple sat at a corner table, her knitting a soft rhythm beneath the chatter, while Celia Bantry played hostess to a small gathering of villagers. The air was thick with unease, Edwin Glass's death a shadow no one could ignore. "Such a shock," Mrs. Lydia Trent said, buttering a scone with unsteady hands. "Who'd want to harm poor Edwin? He was quiet as a mouse." "Quiet, perhaps," said Victor Crane, the solicitor, his voice sharp as his tweed suit. He leaned back, stirring his tea with deliberate calm. "But mice see things, Mrs. Trent, and Edwin's camera saw more than most." Miss Marple's eyes flicked up, catching the edge in Crane's tone. She noted his polished cufflinks one, slightly loose, and the way his gaze darted to Dr. Haydock, who sat silently at the table's end. "You knew Mr. Glass well, Mr. Crane?" she asked, her voice as mild as the chamomile in her cup. Crane stiffened, then smiled thinly. "Well, enough. He photographed my estate last month. Competent work, though he asked too many questions about the manor's history. History can be revealing," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking. "Like a lens, it brings the past into focus." Dr. Haydock coughed, setting down his cup. "Let's not make mysteries where there are none," he said gruffly. "Edwin was clumsy with that camera of his. Could have been an accident for all we know." "An accident?" Lydia Trent's voice rose, incredulous. with his head bashed in and that lens in pieces. Oh, Doctor, you can't believe that." "I believe what the evidence shows," Haydock snapped, then softened, glancing at Miss Marple. "Though I'll grant it's unusual." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind tracing the red wax on Edwin's sleeve, the notebook's cryptic VC, Mannergate, watch. She turned to Lydia, who was twisting her napkin into knots. "Mrs. Trent, you said you saw a shadow before finding Mr. Glass. Did it move toward the vicarage, perhaps?" Lydia blinked, caught off guard. "Well, I'm not sure. It was dark and I was so flustered. But it might have gone that way, yes." "Interesting," Miss Marple said, her tone light but her thoughts heavy. The vicarage, with its nervous vicar and that curious brass key, loomed larger in her mind. She glanced at Celia, who was watching Crane with narrowed eyes, and decided to stir the pot. "I hear Mr. Glass was quite the archivist," she said. "Photographs from years past, perhaps even from 1945. Did he ever show you any, Mr. Crane?" Crane's spoon paused mid-stir, a flicker of unease crossing his face. 1945? That's a lifetime ago. I was barely out of school. Why do you ask?" "Oh, no reason," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "Only that old. Photographs can stir memories. Or trouble." The table fell silent, the weight of her words settling like dust. Haydock cleared his throat, muttering about patience, and excused himself. Crane followed soon after, citing a meeting, though his cufflink caught on his sleeve as he rose, nearly falling. Lydia stayed, her eyes darting between Miss Marple and the door. "Jane," Celia whispered as they left the tea-room, "you rattled them." Crane looked ready to bolt, and Haydock was positively grim. "They're pieces of a puzzle, Celia," Miss Marple said, her gaze on the village lane, where the vicarage's chimney puffed smoke into the grey sky. "But puzzles need edges to hold them together. I think Mr. Glass's photographs, and whoever feared them, will give us those edges." As they walked, Miss Marple's mind turned to Clara Harrow, the woman in Edwin's portrait, and the orchard note from 1945. Tea had stirred suspicions, but it was time, she felt, to focus on what lay hidden in Glasswick's past. Chapter 6. The Broken Alibi. The afternoon light slanted through Glasswick's lanes, painting shadows that seemed to shift with secrets. Miss Marple walked toward the village hall, where Constable Reed had asked to meet her. Celia Bantry trailed behind, her enthusiasm undimmed by the chill in the air. "Jane, I can't stop thinking about that tea," Celia said. "Victor Crane was hiding something. I'd stake my best hat on it. People hide what they fear to lose, Celia," Miss Marple replied, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. "But fear makes them careless. And carelessness, I find, is where truth slips through." Inside the hall, Constable Reed stood by a table strewn with papers, his youthful face creased with worry. "Miss Marple," he said, relief softening his voice, "I'm glad you're here. We've got something on Victor Crane, but it's a muddle." "A muddle?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she settled into a chair. "Do tell, Constable." Reed shuffled his notes. "Crane told me. He was at his manor all evening when Edwin was killed. Said he was sorting case files alone. But Mrs. Phipps, from the post office, swears she saw him near Edwin's cottage around 8. She was posting letters and recognized his coat. 8 o'clock, Miss Marple murmured, her mind slotting the time against Lydia Trent's shadow in the lane. And what does Mr. Crane say to that? Says Mrs. Phipps must be mistaken, Reed said, frowning. Claims his coat was in his study all night. But here's the thing. When I pressed him, he got flustered. Said he might have stepped out to check his garden gate, but only for a moment long enough to be seen, Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. Did you ask about his photographs with Mr. Glass? Reed nodded. He admitted Edwin took pictures of his manor last month, like he said at tea, but he clammed up when I mentioned anything older. Looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly from her bag, a habit that steadied her thoughts. Crane's alibi was fraying, but his unease suggested more than guilt. It hinted at protection. For himself or someone else. She recalled the notebooks. V.C. Manor Gate, watch, and the red wax on Edwin's sleeve. Constable, she said, might I see Mr. Glass's ledger again? The one from his cottage. Reed fetched it from a locked box, and Miss Marple opened it to the client list. Her finger traced entries, pausing at one dated 3 weeks prior. V.C. Manor, urgent, private. Below it, in smaller script, was a single word. Proof. Proof, Celia read aloud, leaning over. Proof of what? Something at the manor? Perhaps, Miss Marple said, closing the ledger. But proof is a dangerous word, Celia. It implies knowledge and leverage. I think Mr. Crane's garden gate may hold more than he admits. Reed scratched his head. Should I bring him in, ma'am? Not yet, Miss Marple said, her smile gentle but firm. Let him think he's safe. A nervous man makes mistakes, and mistakes, Constable, are clearer than any lens. As they left the hall, Celia glanced at the manor's distant chimneys, just visible over the trees. Jane, do you think Crane killed Edwin, or is he covering for someone? Miss Marple's eyes followed Celia's gaze, her mind threading Crane's broken alibi with the vicar's confession and Clara Harrow's haunting portrait. I think, she said softly, Mr. Crane is a man caught in a frame he didn't choose. But whether he's the subject or the photographer, we'll soon see. The village clock tolled, and Miss Marple adjusted her hat. The manor gate, she decided, deserved a closer look, before someone else decided to shatter what it hid. Chapter 7. The Lens of Truth. The evening air in Glasswick carried a bite, as if the village itself sensed the tightening net of suspicion. Miss Marple sat in Celia Bantry's parlour, a single lamp casting soft light over the fragments of Edwin Glass's broken lens, which Constable Reed had entrusted to her for examination. The shards lay on a velvet cloth, their edges jagged but oddly precise, like pieces of a puzzle meant to fit only one way. Jane, what can broken glass possibly tell us? Celia asked, peering over her shoulder. It's just, well, bits. Bits, Celia, are often the whole story, Miss Marple said, her voice serene as she turned a shard under the light. A lens bends truth into clarity. Even shattered, it holds what it once saw. Her fingers, steady despite their age, lifted a curved piece no larger than a shilling. Etched faintly along its rim was a mark, a tiny crescent moon, barely visible. Celia gasped. Is that a maker's mark? Edwin's lenses were custom, weren't they? Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her eyes narrowing. But this feels personal. A signature, or a warning? She set the shard down, her mind weaving the crescent with the red wax, the notebook's lens nose, and Victor Crane's faltering alibi. The lens, she sensed, was more than a tool. It was a key. Earlier that day, Miss Marple had persuaded Reed to let her revisit Edwin's darkroom, where she'd found a hidden drawer beneath the workbench. Inside was a single negative, unmarked but carefully wrapped in waxed paper. She hadn't developed it yet. Glasswick lacked the equipment, and she trusted few with such a delicate clue. But its existence gnawed at her. Edwin had died protecting something, and this lens shard might point to why. "Celia," Miss Marple said, folding the velvet cloth, "I'd like to visit Mr. Crane's manor tomorrow. His gate, I think, has a story to tell." Celia's eyes widened. "You think he's the killer? After that flimsy alibi?" "I think he's a piece of the frame," Miss Marple said, her tone measured. "But frames can mislead. In St. Mary, Mead, I once knew a man who lied about his whereabouts to shield his sister's shame. Mr. Crane's fear may not be for himself." The conversation paused as a knock rattled the door. Celia opened it to find Mrs. Phipps, the postmistress, her face flushed from a brisk walk. "Miss Marple," she said, breathless, "I had to tell you. I remembered something about that night. The shadow Lydia saw. I saw it too, near the manor gate, not the vicarage. And it wasn't Victor Crane." Miss Marple's needles resting in her lap stilled. "Are you certain, Mrs. Phipps?" "As certain as I am of stamps," Mrs. Phipps said firmly. "It was slighter, quicker. Wore a scarf, I think. Disappeared toward the orchard." "Thank you," Miss Marple said, her smile warm but her mind racing. The orchard. Edwin's 1945 note had mentioned it, tied to Clara Harrow. And now a shadow, not Crane's, at the manor gate. The lens shard's crescent moon seemed to gleam brighter in her thoughts. As Mrs. Phipps left, Celia shut the door with a shiver. "Jane, this is getting positively tangled. A shadow in a scarf? Clara's been gone for years. Surely it's not her. Shadows, Celia, are cast by something real," Miss Marple said, tucking the lens shards into her bag. "And I suspect Glasswick's orchard holds more than apples. Tomorrow we'll see what Mr. Crane's gate and his nerves reveal." She glanced at the clock, its tick steady as her pulse. The truth, she knew, was coming into focus, one shard at a time. Chapter 8. Whispers from the Past. The morning mist clung to Glasswick's orchard, softening the gnarled apple trees into ghostly shapes. Miss Marple stood at its edge, her scarf tucked against the damp, her eyes tracing the path that wound toward Victor Crane's manor. Celia Bantry, bundled in a wool coat, shifted beside her. "Jane, this place gives me the shivers," she said. "Why are we here before calling on Crane?" "Because, Celia," Miss Marple replied, her voice as steady as her steps, "the past speaks loudest where it's buried. And this orchard, I believe, holds Glasswick's loudest secret." They had come early, before their planned visit to dine to the manor, prompted by Mrs. Phipps's mention of a shadow, and the notebook's cryptic CH 1945 orchard burn. Miss Marple's inquiries at the village library yesterday had yielded a slim file of old newspapers, one detailing a 1945 incident, a fire in this very orchard, blamed on a vagrant, though no one was charged. Clara Harrow's name appeared as a witness, claiming she'd seen nothing but smoke. Now, as they walked, Miss Marple's gaze fell on a charred stump, half hidden by brambles. It was old, its scars smoothed by time, but it stood like a marker. She knelt, brushing aside leaves to reveal a faint carving in the bark. A crescent moon, identical to the mark on the lens shard. "Good heavens!" Celia whispered, crouching beside her. "That's no coincidence, Jane. What does it mean?" "It means," Miss Marple said, rising, "that Edwin Glass wasn't the first to see something here, and someone feared he'd seen it again." They pressed on to the manor, where Crane greeted them at the gate with a forced smile. His cufflinks gleamed, but his eyes were shadowed, as if sleep had eluded him. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry," he said, gesturing toward the house. "To what do I owe this visit?" "A small matter," Miss Marple said, her tone disarming. "I understand Mr. Glass photographed your gate recently. Might we see where he worked?" Crane hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "It's just iron and stone. Nothing special. The gate was indeed ordinary, its bars rusted but sturdy, overlooking the orchard's edge. Yet Miss Marple's keen eyes caught a detail, a fresh scratch on the lock, as if it had been forced. "Curious," she murmured, glancing at Crane. "Has this gate been opened lately, Mr. Crane?" "Not by me," he said quickly, too quickly. "I told the constable I checked it that night, but I didn't linger. Edwin was nosy, always poking about." "Poking," Miss Marple echoed, her smile gentle. "Like into 1945, perhaps? The orchard fire." Crane's face paled, his hand gripping the gate. "That was ages ago. A silly accident. Why bring it up?" "Oh, no reason," Miss Marple said, her voice light as air. "Only that photographs keep history alive, and Mr. Glass seemed fond of history." As they walked back to the manor for tea, Miss Marple noted Crane's silence, his fingers twitching as if itching to bolt. Over tea he spoke little, but his glances toward the orchard betrayed him. Celia, catching Miss Marple's eye, raised a brow, but Miss Marple only sipped her cup, her mind elsewhere. Later, as they left, Celia whispered, "Jane, he's terrified. That fire, what happened back then?" "I don't know yet," Miss Marple admitted, her gaze lingering on the orchard's mist. "But Clara Harrow saw it, and Edwin photographed it, and someone, Celia, wants that memory burned away. The crescent moon, the fire, the gate's scratch, they were threads, Miss Marple thought, leading to a truth buried deep. And as the manor faded behind them, she felt Glasswick's past whispering louder, demanding to be heard. Chapter 9. The Midnight Visitor. The clock in Celia Bantry's cottage struck 11, its chime swallowed by the stillness of Glasswick's night. Miss Marple sat by the parlour window, her knitting untouched, her eyes fixed on the lane beyond. The crescent moon hung low, casting a faint glow that reminded her of the mark on Edwin's lens and the charred stump in the orchard. She had not told Celia, but the negative from Edwin's darkroom was now tucked inside her knitting bag, a secret she guarded as closely as her thoughts. "Jane, you'll wear yourself out staring into the dark," Celia called from the staircase, her voice muffled by a yawn. "No one's prowling at this hour." "Villages, Celia," Miss Marple said softly, "are never as asleep as they seem. She adjusted her shawl, her mind replaying Victor Crane's pale face, the vicar's trembling hands, and the orchard's whispered history. Someone, she sensed, was watching her as keenly as she watched them. A faint crunch broke her thoughts. Gravel shifting in the lane. Miss Marple leaned closer to the window, her breath steady despite the quickening of her pulse. A shadow moved near the gate, slight and swift, draped in a scarf that fluttered like a moth's wing. It paused, then slipped toward the cottage's side door, where the latch was old and loose. Miss Marple rose silently, her slippers noiseless on the rug. She reached the side door just as a soft scrape sounded. A key, or perhaps a pin, probing the lock. Her hand closed over a brass candlestick, more for show than defence, and she called out, "Who's there?" The scraping stopped. Footsteps retreated, quick and uneven, fading into the night. Miss Marple opened the door, peering into the gloom. The lane was empty, but a glint caught her eye. A scrap of red wax, freshly broken, lying on the step. "Jane!" Celia's voice, sharp with alarm, came from the stairs. "What in heaven's name—" "Hush, Celia!" Miss Marple said, pocketing the wax before turning. "We've had a visitor, that's all. Someone curious about what I know." Celia hurried down, her robe flapping. "Curious? They were trying to break in. We must tell Constable Reed." "In the morning," Miss Marple said, her tone calm but firm. Our visitor left more than they meant to. She held up the wax, its colour vivid even in the dim light. "This matches the trace on Edwin's sleeve, and I suspect it seals more than letters." Celia's eyes widened. "Blackmail? You think Edwin was sending sealed threats? Or receiving them?" Miss Marple said, returning to her chair. "The wax, the lens, the orchard, they're all tied to a truth someone fears, and tonight proves they fear me too." She resumed her knitting, though her mind was far from wool. The shadow's scarf echoed Mrs. Phipps's sighting near the manor gate, and the wax linked Edwin's death to a careful hand, someone who sealed their secrets with care. Clara Harrow's name flickered in her thoughts, alongside the vicar's, confession and Crane's broken alibi. But the negative, still undeveloped, weighed heaviest. What had Edwin captured that warranted such risk? As Celia fretted and bolted the door, Miss Marple's gaze returned to the lane. The moon's crescent seemed to wink, as if urging her on. "Tomorrow," she murmured, "we must find a way to see what Edwin saw, before our visitor tries again." Clock ticked past midnight, and Miss Marple's needles clicked in time. The truth, she knew, was no longer content to hide. Chapter 10. The Gathering Storm. The village hall glowed with lamplight, its wooden beams casting long shadows over the gathered villagers. Miss Marple had suggested the meeting to Constable Reed, framing it as a chance to ease Glaswick's nerves after Edwin Glass's murder. In truth, she wanted the suspects in one room, their defences softened by tea and scrutiny. Celia, Bantry, perched beside her, whispered, "Jane, this feels like a fox among hens. What are you planning?" "To listen, Celia," Miss Marple said, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "People reveal most when they think they're safe." Her knitting lay idle, but her knitting bag, holding the negative and the red wax shard, sat close, a silent partner in her scheme. Constable Reed stood at the front, his notebook open, addressing the small crowd. Victor Crane sat stiffly near the door, his cufflinks catching the light. Dr. Haydock leaned against a wall, arms crossed, his scowl deepening with every mention of Edwin. Lydia Trent fidgeted with her scarf, while Mr. Harrow, the vicar, clutched a hymn book as if it might shield him. Mrs. Phipps hovered near the tea-urn, her ears primed for gossip. "Thank you for coming," Reed began, his voice unsteady. "We're still investigating Mr. Glass's death, and Miss Marple thought, well, that you might have insights." Miss Marple rose, her smile grandmotherly, but her words precise. "A village is like a photograph," she said. "Every face tells a story. Mr. Glass captured yours, didn't he? Weddings, fates, secrets perhaps?" A murmur rippled through the room. Crane's jaw tightened, and Haydock's foot tapped. Lydia blurted, "He was kind, Edwin was, never hurt a soul." "Kindness doesn't prevent harm," Miss Marple said gently. "I found a mark on his lens, a crescent moon. Does that mean anything to anyone?" Silence fell, heavy as fog. Then Harrow cleared his throat, his voice thin. "A moon? It's just a design, surely. Old superstition." "Superstition," Crane snapped, his voice louder than intended, "doesn't smash cameras. Someone wanted Edwin quiet." His eyes darted to Haydock, who glared back. "Quiet? About what?" Miss Marple pressed, her tone mild. "The orchard fire in 1945, perhaps? Or a photograph he took recently, at the manor gate?" Crane froze, his teacup clattering. Haydock stepped forward, his voice rough. "You're fishing, Miss Marple. Edwin was nosy, that's all, poking into things best left alone." "Like sealed letters?" she asked, her gaze sweeping the room. "I found red wax at my door last night. The same wax, I believe, that marked Mr. Glass's sleeve." Lydia gasped, and Harrow's hymn book slipped to the floor. Crane stood abruptly, his chair scraping. "This is nonsense! I've no time for parlour games." He strode toward the door, but Reed blocked his path, uncertain but firm. "Mr. Crane, please," Reed said. "Just answer the question." Crane's face reddened, but he sat muttering, "I know nothing about wax." Miss Marple nodded as if satisfied, though her mind hummed. The room crackled with tension. Harrow's flushed cheeks, Haydock's clenched fists, Lydia's darting eyes. She hadn't mentioned the negative, but their reactions confirmed it. Someone here feared what Edwin had hidden. As the meeting broke up, Celia whispered, "Jane, you've rattled them all." "But who's guilty?" "Guilt, Celia, is like a storm," Miss Marple said, gathering her bag. "It gathers before it breaks, and I think the break is coming soon." Outside the wind howled, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the negative, still unseen. She needed to develop it. But first, she needed to know who'd risk a midnight visit to stop her. Chapter 11. The Second Shattering. The morning sun barely pierced Glasswick's heavy clouds, casting the village in a grey unease that matched Miss Marple's mood. She walked briskly toward the chemist's shop, where a friend of Celia's had promised to develop the negative from Edwin's darkroom. Her knitting bag, heavier with secrets than wool, bumped against her side. Celia hurried to keep pace, her voice low. "Jane, after last night's meeting, I half expected someone to confess on the spot. You had them squirming." "Squirming, Celia, is only the start," Miss Marple said, her eyes scanning the lane. Guilt needs a push to break free. The red wax in her pocket and the crescent moon on her mind urged her forward, but a nagging sense of being watched prickled her neck. At the chemist's, Mr. Gibbs, a wiry man with ink-stained fingers, greeted them with a nod. "Got your negative ready, Miss Marple," he said, leading them to a back room. "Developed it this morning. Odd picture, I'll say." He handed her a single print, still damp. Miss Marple held it to the light, her breath catching. The image showed the manor gate at dusk, its bars framing a figure in a scarf, half turned as if startled. The face was blurred, but a glint of metal, a brooch or pendant, caught the lens. Behind, the orchard loomed, its trees stark against a fading sky. "Good heavens!" Celia whispered. "That's the shadow Mrs. Phipps saw. But who is it?" Before Miss Marple could answer, a crash shattered the quiet. Glass splintered somewhere, in the shop, followed by Gibbs's shout. Miss Marple slipped the photograph into her bag, her heart steady despite the chaos. "Quickly, Celia," she said, moving toward the sound. They found Gibbs in the front, staring at a broken display case. A camera lens, old like Edwin's, lay in pieces among scattered bottles, its rim marked with a faint crescent moon. "Someone threw a brick through the window," Gibbs said, pointing to a jagged hole. "Didn't see who. Ran off toward the church." Miss Marple knelt by the shards, her fingers brushing a fragment. "Another lens," she murmured, "and the same mark." Her eyes flicked to the street where villagers were gathering, their whispers buzzing like flies. Victor Crane stood among them, his face pale, while Dr. Haydock lingered at the edge, his gaze fixed on the broken glass. "Jane, this is no coincidence," Celia said, her voice tight. "Someone knew you were here." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, rising, "and they're growing desperate." She thanked Gibbs, promising to inform Constable Reed, and steered Celia outside. The photograph burned in her thoughts, the scarf, the glint, the orchard's shadow. But the shattered lens felt personal, a warning aimed at her. As they walked, Miss Marple's mind raced. The second lens suggested Edwin had kept more than one secret, each marked by that crescent moon. The figure at the gate wasn't Crane. His build was wrong, but the brooch tugged at a memory. Clara Harrow's portrait in Edwin's cottage had shown a similar gleam at her throat. "Celia," Miss Marple said, pausing, "we must speak to Mr. Harrow again. His sister's name keeps rising, like a ghost that won't rest." "Do you think Clara's back?" Celia asked, eyes wide. "After all these years?" "I think," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm, "someone wants us to believe she never left." The church spire loomed ahead, and Miss Marple quickened her step. The second shattering had shifted the frame, but the picture, she felt, was finally coming into focus. Chapter 12. Guilt in Focus. The vicarage parlour was dim, its curtains drawn as if to shield its secrets from the midday sun. Miss Marple sat across from Mr. Timothy Harrow, her knitting bag at her feet, the photograph and red wax shard tucked safely inside. Celia Bantry perched nearby, her usual chatter subdued by the weight of the moment. Harrow's hands twisted together, his eyes darting to the mantel where Clara's photograph stood, its frame now slightly askew. "Mr. Harrow," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle as a breeze, "I believe you know more about your sister's past and Edwin Glass's death than you've shared." The time for half-truths is past. Harrow's face crumpled, his shoulders sagging like a man unburdened by force. "Miss Marple, I've dreaded this," he whispered. "Clara, she never meant harm. But the orchard fire in 1945, it wasn't what people think." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes keen. "Tell me." He drew a shaky breath. Clara was young, barely 20. She loved a man, someone unsuitable, my father said. They met in the orchard, secret-like. That night they argued. A lantern fell, sparked the dry grass. It wasn't murder, but someone died. A vagrant, they claimed, but Clara swore it was her lover. She fled Glaswick, broken. Edwin was there, you see. He photographed it all before the flames took over. "The crescent moon," Miss Marple said softly, her mind slotting the lenses mark into place. "It was theirs, wasn't it? A token?" Harrow nodded, tears brimming. "Their sign. Clara carved it in the stump, and Edwin etched it on his lenses after. He said it reminded him to see truth, not just beauty." Celia gasped, but Miss Marple's gaze held steady. "And Edwin kept those photographs, didn't he? Proof of what happened?" "Yes," Harrow said, voice hoarse. "He showed me one, years later. Clara running, the fire behind her. He never used it, but he kept it. Said it was his burden too. I thought he'd burned it, but recently he hinted he'd found it again. Said someone else needed to know." Miss Marple's thoughts raced to the negative, the figure at the manor gate. Not Clara, she'd been gone too long, but someone tied to that night. The red wax, the scarf, the brooch. "Mr. Harrow," she said, "did Edwin mention Victor Crane, or Dr. Haydock, or a sealed letter?" Harrow shook his head. "Only that he'd confronted someone. He was scared, Miss Marple. Said the lens had focused on guilt, and it burned him." She nodded, her mind weaving the threads. The fire, Clara's lover, Edwin's lens as a symbol of truth. The guilt wasn't just Clara's, it was shared, a chain linking past to present. The second lens's shattering at the chemist's was no accident. It was a desperate act to bury that truth again. As they rose to leave, Miss Marple paused by the mantel, her fingers brushing the brass key she'd noticed days ago. "This key," she said, turning to Harrow. "Does it fit a cabinet in Edwin's darkroom?" Harrow froze, then nodded slowly. "He gave it to me, for safekeeping. I never opened it." "I think," Miss Marple said, her smile kind but firm, "it's time we did." Outside, Celia clutched her arm. "Jane, it's Clara's guilt, isn't it? But who killed Edwin? Crane, Haydock?" "Guilt, Celia, is a lens of its own," Miss Marple said, her eyes on the village lane. "And I believe it's focused on someone closer than we thought." The key felt heavy in her pocket, a promise of answers. The cabinet, she suspected, held the final piece, and with it, the face of Edwin's killer. Chapter 13. The Final Twist. The air in Edwin Glass's cottage was thick with dust and memory as Miss Marple stood before the locked cabinet in the dark room. Constable Reed hovered nearby, holding a lantern, while Celia Bantry gripped her arm, her breath quick with anticipation. The brass key from the vicarage fit the lock perfectly, turning with a soft click that seemed to echo Glaswick's held breath. "Careful now," Reed said, as Miss Marple eased the cabinet open. Inside were neatly stacked envelopes, each marked with initials and dates. Her fingers brushed one labelled CH, 1945, but another caught her eye. LT, 1955 Orchard. Lydia Trent. Miss Marple's heart thudded, not with surprise but with recognition. The scarf, the brooch, the shadow, it had been there all along. She opened the envelope, revealing a single photograph. Lydia Trent, younger but unmistakable, standing in the orchard, her face twisted with fear as flames flickered in the distance. A man lay at her feet, blurred but clearly dead, a crescent moon pendant glinting at her throat. Celia gasped, "Lydia!" But she found Edwin. She was so shaken. "Too shaken," Miss Marple said softly, her voice steady as she handed the photograph to read. "In St. Mary Mead, I knew a woman who wept loudest to hide her guilt. Lydia's tears were her mask." Reed frowned, clutching the picture. "You're saying Mrs. Trent killed Edwin? Over this?" "Not just Edwin," Miss Marple said, her eyes distant. "The orchard fire wasn't Clara's doing. It was Lydia's. Clara's lover wasn't the vagrant, but the man Lydia loved too. A triangle, you see. Jealousy sparked that fire, and Lydia let Clara take the blame. Edwin's lens caught it, and he kept her secret until he couldn't." She turned to the other envelopes, her fingers swift. Another held a letter, sealed with red wax, addressed to Lydia in Edwin's hand. Its words were brief. "I've found the negative again. We must tell the truth, or it will burn us both." Lydia was at the manor gate, Miss Marple continued, piecing it aloud. Edwin photographed her there, meeting someone. Perhaps Victor Crane, who knew part of the truth. When Edwin pressed her to confess, she panicked. She struck him, smashed his lens to destroy the evidence, but missed the negative I found. "But the second lens," Celia said, "at the chemist's, why?" "Lydia followed us," Miss Marple said. "She knew I was close. Smashing another lens was her warning, her attempt to scare me off. But guilt, you see, is a poor eraser." Reed's face hardened. "I'll fetch her now." They found Lydia at her bakery, flour dusting her hands, but her eyes sharp with fear as Reed entered. "Mrs. Trent," he said, holding up the photograph, "we need to talk." Lydia's gaze locked on the image, and her shoulders slumped. "I never meant to hurt him," she whispered. "Edwin wanted to ruin me after all these years. I loved Thomas, but he chose Clara. That night in the orchard, I only meant to scare them. The fire, it got away. And Edwin, he saw, Miss." "Kill him," Reed pressed. "He was going to tell," Faustus cried, his voice breaking. "I couldn't let him. I hit him once, the lens. I thought it was the negative. I didn't know he'd hidden another." Miss Marple watched, her expression kind but unyielding. "Guilt, Mrs. Trent, is a lens you couldn't shatter. You focused it on yourself." Lydia's tears fell, and Reed led her away, the village's shock rippling behind them. Miss Marple turned to Celia, who looked stunned. "Jane, how did you know?" "People, Celia," Miss Marple said, her smile faint, "are like photographs, developed by their choices. Lydia's choice was clear the moment she stood too close to Edwin's truth. The twist, Lydia, not Clara or Crane as the killer, reframed. Glasswick's past, a secret buried in jealousy and flame, exposed at last. Chapter 14. The Resolution. The sun broke through Glaswick's clouds 2 days later, bathing the village in a light that felt like forgiveness. Miss Marple sat on a bench by the churchyard, her knitting needles clicking softly as she watched villagers pass. Quieter now, their whispers softened by truth. Celia Bantry joined her, a basket of scones in hand, her face a mix of relief and wonder. "Jane, I still can't believe it was Lydia," Celia said, settling beside her. "All those years carrying that secret, and poor Clara, blamed for nothing." "Guilt, Celia, distorts like a cracked lens," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "Lydia's heart broke in that orchard, and she let it break others. But truth, I find, mends what it can." The village had reeled at Lydia's confession, her arrest a quiet affair, handled by Constable Reed with more compassion than pomp. Miss Marple had spent the morning with Mr. Harrow, who wept as he spoke of Clara's return, secretly, a month ago, to clear her name. She'd been the shadow at the manor gate, meeting Crane to ask about old rumours, unaware Edwin had photographed her. Clara, now free of suspicion, planned to stay, her portrait restored to the vicarage mantel with a lighter frame. Miss Marple's final visit had been to Victor Crane, whose broken alibi stemmed not from guilt, but shame. He'd known of the fires, truth, and kept silent to protect his family's name, tied to the orchard's land. A coward's choice, he'd admitted, promising to fund repairs to the church as penance. Dr. Haydock, gruff but honest, had confessed to burning Edwin's threatening letter to Lydia, fearing it would ruin her. "Didn't know she'd kill," he'd muttered, and Miss Marple believed him. Now, as the church bell tolled, Miss Marple folded her knitting. The negative, the wax, the crescent moon, they'd all pointed to Lydia's desperation, her fear that Edwin's lens would expose her crime. The second lens's shattering had been her last gasp to blur the past, but Miss Marple's clarity had prevailed. "Celia," she said, rising, "I think Glaswick will heal. Villages do when secrets are laid bare." Celia smiled, offering a scone. "And you, Jane, back to St. Mary Mead?" "Soon," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "But first, a cup of tea. Mysteries, I find, are thirsty work." They walked toward the tea-room, the village settling into its rhythm. Behind them, the orchard stood silent, its scars softened by new buds. The lens of guilt had shattered, and in its place Glaswick saw hope, focused at last on tomorrow.